What do you imagine when you picture a medieval castle? Perhaps you think of grand halls echoing with lute music and laughter, flagstones warmed by roaring fires, ladies and lords reclining on rich tapestries. And if you happen to be sleeping in a medieval castle today, well, perhaps you dream of four-poster beds, complete with plump duvets and silk sheets. Maybe you envision a rustic yet charming room, smelling of fresh linens and pipe smoke, with thick stone walls keeping out the worst of any winter storm. The reality, however, was decidedly different. However, the hearths were usually too small to warm the large rooms, let alone the occupants who tended to wear heavy clothing and armor. Those looking to get a little warmer would have to crowd together around the meager flames. Fires were also a hassle. They had to be started and maintained constantly, and it took many hours for a room to warm up. Plus, the smoke often seeped through cracks in the ceiling and filled the room with a choking haze. Medieval castles didn't have indoor plumbing, so toilets were usually located outside the castle walls. This meant that they couldn't relax or feel safe, even in the bathroom. Add to that the ever-present danger of disease and illness, and you have a perfect recipe for a sleepless night. This meant that residents had to brave the elements to relieve themselves. Well, for the most part, it came down to necessity. Castles were often the only place to go in times of war or conflict. They provided shelter and protection from the elements, so people were willing to put up with the uncomfortable conditions. In addition, castles were also a status symbol. They showed wealth and power, so it was important for nobles and royalty to live in them, even if it meant enduring the cold, dark and dank conditions. Finally, castles were simply a way of life in the Middle Ages. They were a part of the culture and history of Europe. People were accustomed to living in them, and they saw them as a necessary part of their world. In the winter, this was no easy task. Not only was it uncomfortable, but it was also dangerous. Not exactly the stuff of fairy tales, is it? But that's the thing about history. It's full of surprises. Sometimes it's glamorous, exciting, and full of adventure. But other times it's just plain ugly. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Would you dare spend a night in a medieval castle? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical tales. Thanks for watching. People could slip and fall or be injured by broken or uneven surfaces. It was not unusual for people to break bones or other body parts while relieving themselves in a medieval castle. If you're trying to get a full night's sleep, that's not exactly ideal. During the Middle Ages, castles were fortresses, not homes. The lack of windows in most rooms meant that inhabitants had to rely on torchlight or candlelight to see anything after sunset. Rats and mice sought shelter in the castle's nooks and crannies, and they would often make themselves at home in the bedrooms of the occupants. Fleas and lice were common, and diseases such as the plague were rampant. For anyone hoping for a good night's sleep in a medieval castle, you'd have to contend with scurrying rodents, itchy bites, and the occasional dead mouse in your bed. The flickering lights did little to penetrate the gloom, and many castle dwellers were half-blind simply due to the lack of illumination. Of course, some castles had large windows to allow for more light and sweeping views of the surrounding landscape. However, these were mostly found in the great halls and the bedrooms of the nobility. For the average soldier or servant, you'd be lucky to find a shuttered window in your quarters. They were meant to be imposing, to inspire fear, and to withstand siege. Warmth, comfort, and a good night's sleep were not high on the list of priorities for the builders of Dover Castle, Carcassonne, or Bran Castle. We know what we know about life in the Middle Ages from books, movies, and TV shows. There's a sort of idealized version of life in the past that we like to believe in. But reality was rarely that pleasant. Castles were certainly impressive feats of architecture. They were well defended, and for the most part quite beautiful. But that doesn't mean that living in one was always easy or pleasant. Castles were noisy and food and supplies were often scarce, and disease ran rampant. In fact, for all their bulk, medieval castles were often less cozy than an igloo made of straw. To understand why, let's start with the building blocks of any castle, the walls. Their thickness was considered a sign of both strength and status, and they were typically built of cold stone. In some cases, these walls were several feet thick, which sounds impressive until you realize that, in order to maintain structural integrity, they had to be built over thick layers of insulation. As you might expect, straw mattresses were out of the question. Even if nobility could afford more luxurious bedding, the presence of rats would have ensured that no one slept soundly. After all, it was said that the only things that could travel through the walls of medieval castles were rats and drafts, and the latter was likely true. While castles were built with arrow slits to allow defenders to shoot their bows, while staying safe within the structure, Those same slits allowed the wind to blow right through the building. When winter came, that meant that every room in the castle became an icebox. This wasn't so much a problem for the builders, however, because it was usually the servants, laborers, and soldiers who spent most of their time in the castle, and nobles would only stay there occasionally. For anyone spending the night in a castle, the first thing you'd notice is that it was freezing cold. A medieval castle was like an icebox with people in it. This was largely due to the materials used in construction. Stone is an excellent conductor of heat, meaning that interior rooms were often no warmer than the outside temperature. When the wind blew across the open battlements, it carried away any semblance of warmth within the structure. Even the thickest stone walls could not keep out the chill, and once the sun set, the interior of the castle would quickly grow dark, cold, and damp. The only source of heat in these structures was typically a small fire built in the hearth of each room. Medieval castles were also dark and dank. And finally, medieval castles were typically overrun with pests. Perhaps surprisingly, this isn't all that different from a modern haunted house. Now, let's talk about toilets. There was also the constant threat of attack. Residents had to be prepared to flee at a moment's notice. It's clear then that the conditions in medieval castles were far from ideal. But despite the difficulties, people still lived and worked in castles. So there you have it. That's what it was like to sleep in. As much as we love medieval castles, let's be honest, they're kind of awful places to live. Especially during winter. They're drafty, dank, freezing, dark, and looming stone walls standing defiant against the landscape. But inside those thick walls, the grandeur quickly gives way to discomfort. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. So let us go inside and talk about what it was actually like to live in a medieval castle. Speaking of fires, you notice a charring black line high up on the wall. That's how high the waters rose when the castle was under siege last year. Wonder if that will happen again. For some castle rooms, flagstones were used as flooring. A wooden platform edged with straw, a blanket, a pillow, and a cup. Yep, there's a reason why your bed is situated in the furthest corner of the room. Maybe you'll share a room with several other people, but since you can't talk over the loud snoring, you don't know if they're awake or not. There's a pile of ashes on the hearth and the room's filled with smoke. You need to get up. You wouldn't want to be caught sleeping when the royal family rises. As you sip, you notice a few berries bobbing in the bottom, left over from when the fruit was picked during the fall. How do you stay warm in the winter? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The cook must have forgotten about them. You head back to your room and strip off yesterday's stinky clothes. In a few minutes, you'll be called for duty, so you quickly dress in your finest garments, tuck in your shirt, smooth down your skirt, and adjust your belt. You check your boots, knowing that once you step out into the cold, it'll be a long time before you can warm your toes again. You pull your cloak tight around you and step out into the courtyard. What will the day bring? There's no point in trying to lie back down. The whole room smells like stale waste and rotting wood. You might as well get up and start the day. And anyway, who knows what's lurking in the shadows of this room? You close your eyes again and try to rest, but you can't shake this feeling that someone is staring at you. If you look over, you might be able to tell if one of your roommates is awake, but more likely you'll be blinded by the torchlight and stumble back into darkness. Every winter, a thin layer of ice would form on the walls. One day it would grow thick enough that the guards would sound an alarm. Everyone would rush to the Etrusca rooms and carry their beds to safety. The straw, poked through the linen ticking, itched at your skin, and often harbored lice. It's best to put on all your clothes before getting into bed. Blankets were few. Wool was common, but damp wool on a winter night does little but trap the wetness closer to your body. But for everyone else, from the guards, posted near the ramparts to the scullery maids, sleeping near the kitchen hearth winter was not just uncomfortable. It was physically exhausting. You didn't sleep deeply. You curled in on yourself, chasing fleeting warmth. You shivered. You waited for morning, and often you woke with your water frozen solid beside your bed. If you're lucky, there will be another blanket for you to tuck in around yourself. The alternative is to find a corner and curl up. This was preferable to dirt floors, but the stones were still unforgiving and radiated cold throughout the space. Some rooms had carpets, but these were usually small and expensive luxuries found in the bedrooms of nobles. Most rooms were carpeted with rushes scattered across the floor. These were dried plants that were gathered and spread out over the floor, usually at the beginning of winter. They were periodically changed, but this was done more for the sake of smell than cleanliness. A layer of dried plants does little to stop drafts, but it does make it harder to see the mold growing everywhere else. Sometimes herbs were tossed in, like lavender or rosemary, in a futile attempt to mask the rot of mold, urine, food scraps, and whatever small creatures had died beneath. They didn't help with the temperature, they just made the filth smell slightly floral. When you drop something, you can hear the dry twigs and leaves rustling around it before it hits the floor. Sometimes the servants leave small trails of rushes along the walls, so you know where to walk without crunching too loudly. You really don't want to be stuck in the castle when that happens. Let's get cozy with all the reasons why nobody lives in medieval castles anymore. Large windows made of glass were a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. Most castles were lit by small fires or oil lamps, and those created more heat than light. Larger windows meant more cold air entering the castle and heat escaping. And while we may see this as an inconvenience, it was a major concern for the builders of castles who wanted to keep their structures as secure as possible. Those few windows that did exist were usually covered with oiled parchment that flapped and cracked in the breeze, doing little to block the elements. And those massive iron doors and timber gates, marvels of defense, yes, but leaky barriers to the outside world. The cold came in through every seam. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. There is a certain majesty to a medieval castle from the outside its turrets. Towers. The first thing you notice when you walk into most castle interiors is the lack of light. Great, grey, unmortared blocks of stone retain the cold like a sponge holds water. They were icy to the touch, radiating chill into every room, every corridor, every chamber, even long after the fires died down. During winter, the cold would settle into the walls and linger for weeks, unmoved by weak sunlight or spars. We think of stone as hard and cold, but they're also excellent at retaining heat. It's why modern builders use brick or concrete, which are better conductors of heat than stone. In a castle, those thick walls were both an advantage and a disadvantage. While they kept out invaders, they also kept out warmth. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of a large hall watching men-at-arms rehearse battle tactics. The massive double doors are thrown open to let in fresh air. Even though the sun is shining, you can't help but shiver because the cold from the wall is seeping into your bones. Your breath hangs in the air, fogging up before you. Maybe it's best to stay by the hearth and watch the flames dance instead. But then you remember, those roaring fires weren't always safe. Remember the Great Fire of Windsor Castle in 1992? That might be a bit more exciting than sitting next to a dying fire and waiting for someone to top up the logs. But there's nothing quite as relaxing as watching a fire, especially when it's not going to burn your house down. But now you're awake, aren't you? Time to stretch and get ready for the day. It's time to get up. Windows were often little more than slits arrow loops, designed to repel invaders, not the wind. And that brings us to the floors. A delightful jumble of dirt, gravel, broken pottery, and the occasional stray dog bone. No insulation here. If you're staying in the bedroom, you've been assigned to. You notice your bed has been prepared for the evening. Speaking of corners, remember the charring black line high up on the wall? You've finally fallen asleep. But how long will it last? Will you wake in the middle of the night for no apparent reason? You wake up and realize it's morning already. The fire's burnt out. There were no separate sleeping chambers for warmth. Nobles might have a fire in their room, tended to by a servant. Maybe you'd wake up early enough that you could race to the kitchens, grab some breakfast and warm your hands on a mug of hot spiced cider. Thanks for watching. In our modern age, we've come to rely on certain things in order to get a good night's sleep. A comfy bed, cool dark room, maybe a fan for white noise. Without these comforts, many of us toss and turn all night, desperate for sleep. But it wasn't too long ago that these things were commonplace. When you live in a place like this, which is decidedly not tropical, you're going to need a good way to keep warm. Fire was life. But fire in a medieval castle was more complicated than you might imagine. Many great halls were double height, with exposed beams and windows under the eaves. A medieval mattress was not the springy feather-stuffed affair we imagine from later centuries. As we said, most people slept in the same bed as their family. Often several people in a bed meant for two. This wasn't ideal, but it was necessary for warmth. This would have been made of wood and quite heavy. For nobles, it might have meant swatting flies in the summer or keeping mice out of their pantry. Either way, it was an essential part of daily life. Now watch how horrible toilets really were in medieval times, or check out medieval weapons that you didn't know existed. They weren't moved often, so they were usually placed permanently in one spot. Commoners were more likely to have a simple wooden frame with a hanging cloth to act as a curtain. Regardless of the type of bed you had, everyone used a thick mattress covered in a blanket and a sheet. Pillows were uncommon. but some wealthy people used them. They were usually filled with feathers or down, which could be expensive. As we mentioned, the most common type of mattress was stuffed with straw or hay, but wealthier people might have had mattresses filled with wool or feathers. Bedding was rarely washed, so it's not surprising that some people developed skin problems, especially lice. They could be treated with herbs or by shaving the affected area. But it was important to act quickly because the longer the infestation lasted, the harder it was to get rid of. If you were lucky enough to have your own bed, it was probably in a small alcove or a recess in the wall. This kept the drafts out and gave you a sense of privacy. It also helped to contain the lice that inevitably infested your bedding. Privacy was a rare commodity in a medieval castle. These were not the days of do not disturb signs or sleeping with your mouth open, eyes staring blindly ahead. If your neighbor snored, you couldn't escape. You just had to endure. Likewise, if your neighbor needed to get up for, well, any reason, you'd probably wake up, too. Privacy was something you didn't have, but you did have control over your own blanket. It was your one personal item in a sea of shared space, and you guarded it fiercely. Your blanket was your domain. You wrapped yourself in it as much as possible, tucking it around you and over your head as you fell asleep. This helped to conserve body heat and stay warm in the cold winter months. Blankets were also used to divide up shared beds. Each person would have their own small space to retreat into, and this helped to establish a sense of personal boundaries within the larger bed. It was, more often than not, a large saculi linen or rough canvas stuffed with straw, hay or dried reeds. In fact, one of the biggest reasons for the prevalence of curtains in medieval castles was their use as a bed curtain. Bed curtains were hung from a wooden frame above the bed and could be drawn around the bed to create a private, draft-free space for sleeping. They were often heavy and insulated with layers of fabric to keep out the cold air. In addition to providing privacy and warmth, bed curtains also helped to contain the smells of stale waste and chamber pots that were common in medieval castles. They also acted as a barrier between the living and the dead. In a time when disease and death were common, bed curtains helped to prevent the spread of illness by creating a physical barrier between the sick and the healthy. The curtains could be washed separately from the rest of the bedding, which helped to prevent the spread of infection. Finally, bed curtains provided a sense of security in a time when people were often vulnerable while sleeping. They created a physical barrier that helped to protect sleepers from intruders or animals. Over time, the contents flattened and clumped. The ticking fabric grew stained and brittle, and between those seams, lice made their homes. The average person didn't have their own bed. Families shared one sleeping platform. Servants shared makeshift beds or crowded together on pallets on the floor. Bedfellows were a necessity, not a luxury more. People meant more warmth. Even if it meant waking up with someone's elbow in your ribs or a cold foot pressed against your back. In noble households, there were slightly better options: wooden bed frames, sometimes with curtains or canopies. But those curtains weren't decorative. They were functional, meant to trap body heat and block out the worst drafts. Even still, the air inside was chilly, and condensation often froze on the inside of the fabric by morning. And don't forget the pests. Rats were everywhere. They skittered across beams at night, rummaging for crumbs in the rushes. Fleas nestled in woolen blankets. Lice burrowed into the seams of clothing. Never removed in winter, there were no laundromats, no hot water. Washing bedding meant boiling water over fire, scrubbing cloth with harsh lye, then drying everything slowly, awkwardly near the fire. Most people didn't bother. They just slept in the same filth, night after night, hoping the cold would keep the bugs sluggish. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. But every night, you curled into the straw, wrapped your cloak tightly around you, and tried to forget the scratching at your ankle and the gnawing in the rafters. Beautiful to behold, terrible to survive. So, people learned to live in layers. Woolen tunics, fur-lined hoods, mittens made from scraps. Children were bundled together. Adults clung to each other. Dogs were often welcomed into bed not for love, but for heat. The fire burned. The smoke curled. The chill lingered. And so, they shivered. The hearth was central to most rooms, especially in the great hall. But that fire had its limitations. The chimney system was primitive. Smoke filled the space, rising slowly and choking the air. Ceilings were black with soot. Eyes burned. Even nobles, swaddled in fine wool, found themselves coughing and tearing up from the constant haze. So what about 600 years ago? How did medieval Europeans get through the long night in the depth of winter? Let's find out. Wet wood smoked more than it burned. Charcoal, while less smoky, was precious. In some places, It was only available in spring or summer, meaning that during winter, fires were built with whatever could be found: damp sticks, old beams, dung, and the heat. It didn't spread far. The hearth warmed only the immediate area. Take a step away, and the temperature dropped sharply. A person might warm their hands, then retreat to their bed, only to feel that same frigid air seeping into their bones. The fire didn't follow you. There was no central circulation, no closed doors to trap heat. Some castles had braziers, metal bowls filled with coals, but they were dangerous, emitting fumes that could suffocate a sleeper in the night. Others tried using warmed stones wrapped in cloth and tucked into beds. They helped a little for a little while, but they cooled quickly. Winter is coming. Winter is here. Winter will always be here. And that's the problem. And lighting a fire was a laborious process. Wood had to be chopped and dried, no small task in the middle of winter when forests were frozen and paths were treacherous. Worse still, castles were designed to vent smoke and heat alike. High ceilings and open rafters carried warmth upward. Let's turn now to the beds themselves, such as they were. Sleeping arrangements in a medieval castle depended on who you were. We mentioned curtains before, and they weren't just for the window. If you were wealthy, you may have had a four-poster bed, a bed with curtains on all sides. Sleep in a medieval castle was hard won. For most people, it meant battling the cold, the darkness, and the discomfort. Castles are often romanticized as places of splendor and luxury, homes of noble kings and queens. But life behind those high castle walls wasn't always easy, especially during the brutal winter months. Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be exploring the reality of castle life during the coldest season of the year. From overflowing toilets to patrols in the bitter dark, we'll uncover what really went on in a castle when winter came calling. The stone underfoot is slick with frost. Your breath clouds in front of your face. Your fingers ache beneath thin woolen gloves. You are a castle guard. One of the most infamous royal winter births occurred in 1605, when England's King James I welcomed his son, Prince Henry, during a raging snowstorm. Imagine that. But being born in winter wasn't just about braving the elements. Winter held a unique set of challenges for royal families. She was a trained professional, often a woman experienced in the art of childbirth, assisting mothers through the long and arduous process of giving birth. Despite the dangers and difficulties, midwives were highly respected members of the community. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, dwindling supplies, and the risk of deadly illnesses. The title wasn't hereditary, but earned through deeds. The Winter King was a symbol of strength and bravery, often bestowed upon a warrior who achieved a significant victory during the winter months. Don't forget to stay tuned for more historical tales. Until next time, keep cozy and warm. This recognition celebrated courage and skill in the face of winter's challenges. One famous example was King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. He earned the title during the 30 Years' War. His military genius led to victories against larger forces in freezing conditions, showcasing exceptional leadership. The Winter King wasn't just a military honor, it was a testament to human resilience during winter. It recognized the extraordinary efforts and achievements of those who dared to challenge the odds in the heart of winter. Battles were more strategic, less frontal assaults, more skirmishes and sieges. Winter also impacted weapons and armor. Swords and shields were just as useful in winter, but artillery and gunpowder weapons suffered. Cold, wet conditions damaged equipment, making some firearms unreliable. Cannon barrels froze, slowing or stopping cannon fire. Even cavalry, a major force in warfare, was affected. Horses were magnificent, but managing them in winter was challenging. Keeping horses fed, watered, and free of illness was key. Stables had to be heated, and vets were needed to treat cold-related issues. All this added complexity to military operations. Commanders had to think about logistics and strategy differently. For example, Napoleon's army suffered greatly during their Russian campaign. They faced severe cold, hunger, and exhaustion, leading to massive losses. Military leaders learned the hard way that winter was not just a time of rest, but an active phase of conflict. Adapting to the challenges of winter was crucial for success. During winter, their role became even more crucial. Imagine the challenges they faced. Snowy roads made it tough for women to reach birthing centers. Limited supplies meant working with what they had, and the threat of winter illnesses loomed large. But midwives persevered. They provided warmth, comfort, and most importantly, medical expertise. Thanks to their skills, Countless babies entered the world safely, even in the heart of winter. Their knowledge of herbs and remedies helped ease pain and prevent infections. They were also skilled at recognizing complications and knew when to call for help. Despite the lack of modern medical technology, midwives played a vital role in saving lives. They were the unsung heroines of wintertime births, and while their work was often overlooked, they were essential to the well-being of mothers and babies alike. For a child like King Louis XIV of France, born in 1638, it also meant facing a different kind of challenge. You see, Louis was next in line to the throne, and his father, King Louis XIII, had some concerns. What was their approach to treating illnesses and injuries during the harsh winter months? Medicine in the Middle Ages was a mix of ancient traditions, religious beliefs, and practical experience. Doctors often specialized in certain areas like surgery or treating women's ailments. Surgery was a risky field. Surgeons worked in close quarters, sometimes without proper tools. The lack of anesthesia meant painful procedures, and infections were rampant due to unwashed hands and instruments. During winter, the cold weather brought unique challenges. Illnesses like pneumonia and frostbite were common. Treatments were often more invasive than today, involving bloodletting or herbal remedies. While some treatments might seem bizarre today, they were the best options available at the time. Surgeons relied on their senses and years of experience to diagnose and treat patients. They treated everything from common colds to battlefield injuries, and their work was essential in saving lives, even during the toughest winter months. See, the previous king had died without a direct heir, leaving the throne to Louis XIII. But now, Louis XIII himself was nearing his mortal end. He needed to ensure a smooth transition of power, and that meant finding a queen for Louis, his 5-year-old son. But why was this so urgent? Well, time was of the essence. Back then, finding a wife for political gain was all about appearances. A king needed to look strong and capable, and a newborn baby boy with a new queen by his father's side made a pretty powerful statement. It showed stability and legitimacy. However, the pressure didn't end there. As Louis XIII planned for his son's future, he had to consider the kingdom's interests. The young king's marriage would be a key part of his legacy, and with winter approaching, it was crucial to find a suitable bride quickly. After all, travel was much more difficult during the snowy months, so as the clock ticked and the winter snows fell, the stakes were high. Louis XIII needed to secure a queen for his son, cementing their place on the throne and shaping the future of the kingdom. It was a race against time, but being born into the royal family in winter wasn't just about battling the elements. There were unique challenges that came with being a little prince or princess arriving during the coldest months. Firstly, let's talk about the weather. Winter storms weren't just dramatic, they were downright dangerous. Back then, roads were rough, and without modern heating systems, traveling through the snow was a risky venture. Plus, you had to consider the health risks. Being born in the winter put infants at a higher risk of cold-related illnesses. No cozy incubators back then, just swaddling and hoping for the best. And don't forget about the limited availability of fresh food. Winter meant fewer fresh fruits and vegetables, which could make it harder for new mothers to produce breast milk. We now know how important breast milk is for a baby's health, so this posed a significant challenge for wintertime parents. Then there's the impact on daily life. Imagine trying to keep a newborn warm and fed while also worrying about icy conditions, limited supplies, and the safety of family members traveling through the snow to visit you. It was a lot to handle, even for the royal family. But despite all these challenges, winter births were still seen as special occasions, even if they meant enduring a blizzard. After all, who wouldn't want to celebrate the arrival of a new member of the royal family? While most people suffered through winter indoors, those assigned to watch the gates or patrol the walls did so in the open air. Their task, to scan the distant hills, peer through darkness and snow, and listen for movement, human or otherwise. And all of this, hour after hour, in near silence and bone-deep cold. There was no shelter atop the war walk. Wind screamed across the battlements, chapping skin and numbing toes. Armor was heavy and cold iron chilled the flesh beneath. Many guards wore padded gambesons instead, thick quilted coats designed to trap heat, but sweat would form under the padding and freeze moments later, chilling them even further. Fires were not lit atop towers, smoke gave away position. Torches were kept low or used only in emergencies. So the guards relied on layers of clothing, tightly wound, cloaks, and constant movement. Still, fingers stiffened, teeth chattered, feet lost sensation. Relief came in shifts, but even short shifts in the bitter dark could leave lasting damage: frostbite, chilblains, or worse. Some castles had guardhouses with small hearths inside, but these were usually reserved for captains or elite soldiers. The common man shivered through his duty. And sleep. It came in short snatches during the day, bundled in damped wool in a cramped barracks, surrounded by snoring comrades and creaking floors. To keep a castle safe during winter was no small feat. It demanded endurance, fortitude, and a willingness to suffer in silence, hour after frozen hour. Now imagine this. It's the dead of winter. Inside the castle walls, life wasn't all hardship. Winter brought its own bounty. Hearty stews and roasted meats warmed to the belly. Breads and ales flowed. During the feast, long tables groaned with boar, venison, peacock, pies filled with game. And if you were lucky enough to be invited, you could enjoy a roaring fire, lively music, and the company of lords and ladies. But such feasts were rare. For many, winter meant scarcity. Food stores dwindled, supplies grew costly, and hunting, though plentiful, was dangerous. Snow fell, burying crops under drifts of white. Gardens froze, silent and lifeless. Fields turned to ice, too hard to till, too cold to sow. Hunger stalked the land, gnawing at empty bellies. People struggled, searching for work, for food, for a way to survive another day. In the shadow of the towering castle walls, destitution lurked. Starvation wasn't uncommon. Some nobles offered charity, others turned away the desperate. Life in a castle during winter was a story of extremes, from bountiful halls to barren fields, from warm hearths to biting winds. It was a tale of contrasts, of luxury and want, of feasting and famine, all under a sky that seemed determined to freeze the world. You've finally settled into your lumpy straw mattress, fully clothed, wrapped in a scratchy woolen cloak, just barely beginning to drift into a fitful sleep, and nature calls. In a modern world, you'd simply shuffle to the bathroom, but in a medieval castle, that journey could feel like a polar expedition. Castles had garderobe stone or wooden seats built into the outer wall, with a hole that dropped waist down into a chute or pit far below. Some chutes emptied into the moat, others simply spilled onto the ground beneath the castle walls. The smell lingered. It was pungent in summer. In winter, it froze. Waste turned solid. The cold air blasted up through the shaft, rushing directly against your bare skin. Most people avoided using them at night, especially in the bitterest months. Climbing through dark, icy corridors, perhaps several floors down, barefoot or in thin leather shoes, was a task to dread. Torches were scarce, candles expensive. You were at risk of slipping, of getting lost, or simply of freezing before reaching your destination. So what did people do instead? They used chamber pots. These humble vessels, clay, metal, or woodwork, kept under beds or beside pallets. You did your business in the pot, often in full view of others in the room. Privacy was a fantasy, and once the pot was full, someone, usually a servant, sometimes yourself, had to dump it in the morning. Now imagine those pots in winter. The contents didn't just smell, they froze. The sloshing mess turned into slush, then too hard, glacial chunks. The smell didn't vanish with the cold. Either it simply took on a new, acidic sharpness, and sometimes the pot cracked in the night, or spilled, or got kicked in the dark. That's the kind of rude awakening that made you reconsider your water intake at dinner. This was life in a castle, freezing, filthy, and far from romantic. You won't believe what goes on in a castle bathroom. Life on the castle walls. Now step outside, up onto the high ramparts or towers of the castle. Feasting and famine. A royal birth in the winter snowed. Not even royalty was immune to winter's icy grip, as history tells us. King in the cradle. Even kings couldn't escape the pressures of winter, whether it was the weather, the politics, or the delicate health of a newborn. Medieval midwifery. But how exactly did people bring new lives into the world during the cold winter months? Enter the medieval midwife. Medieval medicine. Now let's turn our attention to the doctors and surgeons of the time. Warfare. But what about during wartime? How did winter affect military strategies and battles? Warfare in winter was a test of endurance. The Winter King. Lastly, let's discuss a fascinating historical figure associated with winter, the Winter King. From the hardships of everyday life to the bravery of those who conquered the winter months, these stories offer a glimpse into a world where survival was a daily challenge, and where winter was more than just a season. It was a test of human spirit. And there you have it, A journey through a castle in winter. When we think of medieval clothing, we typically imagine knights in armor, complete with shining chainmail, polished breastplates, and plumed helmets. Alternatively, we picture elegant ladies in flowing gowns, cinched waists, and elaborate hats. While these outfits were reserved for special occasions like tournaments or feasts, the average person's winter wardrobe was decidedly less fancy and mountainous or flat. There was no universal set of clothing worn by everyone everywhere. Winter was hard. Most castle floors were made of packed earth or uneven stone, covered in straw, rushes, or even dried moss. Frozen pipes and icicles were common sights in winter, especially in northern Europe. The wealthy could afford better food, warmer clothes, and live in grander homes, but even they weren't safe from the dangers of winter. The medieval world was dirty, and there is no better way to illustrate that point than by examining the filth that inevitably collected during the colder months. Frozen waste, caked floors, and smoky holes were just a few of the inconveniences of life in the Middle Ages, and while they're gross to us now, they were just part of everyday existence back then. Thanks for watching. For those without access to indoor plumbing, collecting water for cleaning was a challenge in and of itself. Heated water was even rarer. Keeping a fire going consistently was difficult enough in the best of circumstances, but winter demanded almost constant fires to stave off hypothermia. Heating water for scrubbing, washing, or even just wiping down a trestle table took time, fuel, and dedication. Scrubbing surfaces with ash or a rough cloth was usually the best you could do, and that's assuming you had access to a hearth. For those who didn't, frigid temperatures, combined with the lack of heated water, meant grime stuck around longer. More times than not, dirt and grime were ground into the surface of objects rather than being wiped away. In other words, the dirtier something got, the harder it was to clean. This was especially true of castle floors. They were usually made of packed earth or uneven stone, covered in straw, rushes, or even dried moss. These materials helped insulate against the cold, absorbed spills, and soaked up the less savory things life inevitably sent their way. However, over time, they grew disgusting. They were caked with grease, bits of food, soot from the hearth, animal waste, and human bodily fluids. Servants were supposed to sweep the rushes regularly, but in winter, with fewer hands working and fires roaring almost constantly, the floors got filthy fast. Combine this with the fact that most medieval houses and castles didn't have proper chimneys until the late Middle Ages, and you have a recipe for disaster. Smoke from hearths just drifted upward into the great hall, darkening the ceiling beams and coating the stones in sticky black soot. The air was thick, your eyes stung, and the smell lingered in your hair and clothes. Also adding to the unpleasant ambience were the animals that were often inside the castle walls. Horses, chickens, goats, and dogs all brought warmth, companionship, and a steady supply of manure. Manure piles just outside the walls could freeze into jagged mounds that thawed into a reeking swamp come spring. Though some larger homes had dedicated latrines, many people didn't. Instead, they did their business in corners or out the window. In winter, frozen waste froze onto whatever unfortunate passerby happened to walk by. If you were already frozen to the bone, the last thing you needed was a bucket of excrement hitting you squarely in the back of the head. These materials helped insulate against the cold, absorbed spills, and soaked up the less savory things life inevitably sent their way. However, over time, they grew disgusting. They were caked with grease, bits of food, soot from the hearth, animal waste, and human bodily fluids. Servants were supposed to sweep the rushes regularly, but in winter, with fewer hands working and fires roaring almost constantly, the floors got filthy fast. Combine this with the fact that medieval houses and castles rarely had proper chimneys, and you have a recipe for disaster. Most medieval castles didn't have proper chimneys until the late Middle Ages. Smoke from hearths just drifted upward into the great hall, darkening the ceiling beams and coating the stones in sticky, black soot. The air was thick, your eyes stung, and the smell lingered in your hair and clothes. Also adding to the unpleasant ambience were the animals that were often inside the castle walls. Horses, chickens, goats, and dogs all brought warmth, companionship, and a steady supply of manure. Manure piles just outside the walls could freeze into jagged mounds that thawed into a reeking swamp come spring. Though some larger homes had dedicated latrines, many people didn't. Instead, they did their business in corners or out the window. In winter, frozen waste froze onto whatever unfortunate passerby happened to walk by. If you were already frozen to the bone, the last thing you needed was a bucket of excrement hitting you squarely in the back of the head. In general, though, wool was the winter fabric of choice. Natural fibers like wool and linen were preferred because they could absorb moisture without feeling wet like cotton. Unfortunately, wool was also heavy and prone to dampness. If you did get wet, you stayed wet. That is why having an extra tunic or a pair of hose was so nice to have in the winter. Layering your clothing not only gave you the ability to shed or add clothing based on the fluctuating temperatures throughout the day, but it also doubled as a built-in blanket. Layers caked with sweat, food stains, and the musk of unwashed bodies might sound off-putting to us today, but they were necessary for survival. A good cloak was a treasured possession, something that you kept for years, perhaps even decades. A thick one could mean the difference between being warm and miserable. For the nobility and higher clergy, fur linings were ideal, but rare. Most fur belonged to the nobles or clergy. The poor made do with old scraps, sometimes sewn together crudely into collars or cuffs. For footwear, leather shoes offered little insulation. Many people wore socks made out of linen or wool, and some wrapped their feet in rags. Others stuffed their shoes with straw. Given that most people were too poor to own multiple pairs of shoes, let alone boots, this wasn't the most effective method of staying warm, but it certainly was an option. Let us take a look at how peasants and nobles alike braved the elements during the coldest months of the year. Medieval clothing had two main purposes. 1. To denote social class, and 2. To keep you from freezing to death. Clothing wasn't just an indicator of wealth or status. It was a symbol of everything you represented politically and religiously. The lower your social standing, the plainer your clothes were likely to be. If you were a peasant, chances are you only owned a couple of sets of clothes for every season, which is pretty fitting considering the fact that you wore them for weeks, sometimes months at a time without washing. This isn't to say that the upper classes bathed more frequently. They did. However, servants and laborers weren't generally compensated in a way that allowed for luxuries such as laundry services. Medieval clothing was expensive to make and time-consuming to wash. Even if you could afford to buy new clothes on a regular basis, having them cleaned was a luxury in and of itself. There were public bathhouses available in some towns and cities, but many people either couldn't afford them or were wary of contracting some sort of communicable disease while bathing communally. Instead, when laundry day rolled around, it was usually done at home. Linen, which was commonly used for undergarments and shirts, could be boiled in lye, scrubbed with the ashes of wood fires, and then hung up to dry. Wool, on the other hand, was much trickier. You couldn't wash it too frequently or use too much heat, lest the material shrink or stiffen. Therefore, most people avoided washing their wool garments altogether during the winter. Because the climate of medieval Europe varied so widely depending on whether you were further north or south, coastal or inland. No matter how many layers you wore, cold crept through the seams, burrowed through cloth, and nestled itself in your bones. The other major problem with winter living was water. If you were fortunate enough to have a home with running water, winter sucked. No matter the size of your social class, your odds of dying of cold, exposure, or illness were pretty high. In the shadow of the grim castle walls, nestled amongst the evergreens, stood a small cottage. Inside, an elderly woman sat hunched over a small fire. Her gnarled hands worked deftly as she concocted a brew of herbs and spices, the steam carrying their pungent aroma through the tiny room. Outside, the wind moaned, its icy fingers drumming against the glass panes. But within the cottage, a sense of warmth and safety prevailed. This was the home of the wise woman, a healer whose remedies and knowledge had become a beacon of hope for the villager. Her calm was shattered by a frantic pounding on the door. She looked up, her gaze sharp despite her age. "What troubles him?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of sickness and fear. She gently felt the man's forehead, wincing at the heat that radiated from his skin. "He has a fever," she stated, turning to the couple, her voice grave. "We will pull the tooth," she said, her voice firm with resolve. The husband winced at her words. "Will it hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. "And his tooth is causing him great pain. We must act swiftly." Holding it up, she showed it to the man. "The source of your pain is gone," she said, her voice gentle. A middle-aged man lay on a straw pallet, his face contorted in pain. She had seen countless winters like these, each one a testament to nature's fury and the tenacity of life. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The room was filled with the soothing scent of herbs and spices, a comforting contrast to the biting cold outside. The old woman's gnarled hands moved with practiced grace as she stirred a potion, its liquid depths reflecting the firelight. Yet even in the darkest, coldest days, there was always hope, a flickering flame that refused to be extinguished. His wife sat beside him, her hands clasped in a silent prayer. The music and laughter from the village square faded into the distance, replaced by the wind's mournful song. There would be more calls for help in the morning, more ailments to soothe, more hearts to comfort. But for tonight, she would rest, drawing strength from the knowledge that somewhere in the village, life was finding a way to endure and even thrive in the heart of winter. She knew that for those in the grips of illness or poverty, the night would be long and hard. But she also knew that the human spirit, like the flame of a candle, could withstand even the fiercest winds. A sound that brought a flicker of cheer to the old woman's heart. From somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint strains of music, carried on the wind, a melody both lively and hopeful. In her dreams, she joined the villagers in their merrymaking, their laughter and joy echoing in her ears. For, in the darkest depths of winter, hope, like a stubborn ember, refused to be extinguished, and the human spirit, resilient and tenacious, pressed on, finding strength in unity, courage in adversity, and hope in the promise of a new dawn. The old woman smiled, recognizing the tune. It was a song of courage, a ballad of resilience, a melody that spoke of enduring the harsh winter's embrace, and the promise of spring's eventual return. At the sight of the newcomers, the woman looked up, her eyes pleading for solace. Through the swirling snow, she could just make out a group of villagers gathered in the village square. Despite the biting cold, they were engaged in a rousing game of winter revelry, their laughter echoing with childlike abandon, their voices mingling with the music. But within the cottage, a sense of peace prevailed. For the moment, the biting winds and the relentless snows were kept at bay. Life, in its quiet persistence, endured. The door burst open, admitting a young man, his face pale and drawn. He begs for relief. Bring a stout cloak. We must hurry, she said. These people, with their indomitable spirit, their capacity for joy even in the face of hardship, were a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. She watched them for a while, a faint smile gracing her lips. The wife reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the tooth from the woman's hand. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and relief. As the wind outside howled like a hungry wolf, they set off into the swirling snow. The young man led the way, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, his shoulders bowed against the wind. The man hissed at the contact, but the expression of pain on his face soon gave way to a grimace of concentration as he bit down on a cloth to staunch the flow of blood. The old woman's wrinkled hands worked with surprising strength and precision as she levered the tooth from its socket. The man's clenched jaw betrayed his discomfort. The rest is up to the body's natural defenses. The wise woman followed at a slower pace, her staff tapping a steady rhythm on the hard-packed snow. "Wise woman, please, you must help me," he cried, his voice hoarse with urgency. "My father, he is in terrible pain." Toothaches were a common ailment in these biting months, a tormentor that gnawed relentlessly until extracted. The old woman rose slowly, her joints cracking like dry twigs. The sight that greeted them upon arrival was one of hardship. Snow piled high, roofs sagging under its weight. A few meager fires struggled against the encroaching cold. The houses were mostly dark, suggesting that many had given in to the day's chill and retired indoors. His tooth, the young man blurted out, his eyes wide with distress. "It is killing him. He cannot eat. He cannot sleep." The wise woman nodded, understanding. Winter's icy grip could be harsh, sapping the body's strength and leaving one vulnerable to ailments and pain. As she prepared to leave, the old woman turned to the man. Their destination was the village, a cluster of modest dwellings huddled together as if for warmth. The young man's home was a modest affair, its windows frosted over, smoke curling from its chimney like a wisp of hope. The wise woman approached the bed, her wrinkled face creasing with concern. The wife cried out, her voice breaking with despair. "But what can be done? What can be done?" The wise woman placed a calming hand on the woman's shoulder. The wise woman shook her head. "Not if I am successful," she replied, reaching for the pouch at her side. She began the process by making an incision in the gums, using a sharp blade. Finally, with a grunt of effort, the wise woman successfully extracted the offending tooth. The man nodded dumbly, his earlier anguish replaced by a dazed relief. The wise woman nodded, "I have done all I can," she said, her voice raspy. As she made her way back through the village, the snow-laden trees creaking overhead, the old woman pondered the resilience of the human spirit. In the confines of her humble cottage, tucked away from the howling wind, she prepared for her own evening. As the hours passed, the storm outside reached its crescendo, the wind screaming like a tormented beast. But even as the storm raged on, there was a sound that cut through the wind's mournful cry. She rose slowly, her joints protesting with pops and creaks, and walked to the window. The old woman's heart warmed. As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, the old woman returned to her fire. With renewed determination, she settled back into her chair. Her work was not done. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, the old woman closed her eyes, her weathered face etched with wisdom and serenity. Welcome back to life in medieval times. And finally, let's talk about being a woman in a medieval castle during winter. The burdens were heavier, but in the cold months, they deepened. If the Lord was away on crusade maneuvering his armies, jousting in tournaments, or attending a royal court hundreds of miles away, she attended church services whenever possible, and made sure her children did the same. Unlike noblewomen, their job was easier in the winter, because most of their work was done inside. She measured out flour, mixed yeast and water, kneaded dough, rolled out loaves, placed them in the oven, and then did it all over again. Privacy didn't exist. Painkillers were non-existent. Sometimes, a peasant woman gave birth alone. Sometimes, a midwife helped her. But whether or not anyone else was present, the mother screamed loudly. If a child was born healthy, peasants celebrated, because another mouth meant more hands to help with farm work. If the child was sickly, they hid it, hoping that if no one saw or heard anything, then magic or evil spirits wouldn't notice either. If the mother died, her name was quietly added to the ledger. After breakfast, she cleaned up the kitchen. Then she set the table for lunch. In reality, she was probably exhausted, aching, and cold. For the peasant woman, the cold seeped into her bones and stole her breath. Her fingers were stiff and hard to move. Her head throbbed. Her belly swelled. She was tired. But tomorrow, the sun would come up anyway, and she'd have to start the fire. Once again, thank you for watching. Be sure to check out our new series, available on our channel and elsewhere online. We'll see you next time. She served up whatever dishes were ready. Sliced apples, pears, nuts and cheeses. Maybe there were roasted meats, loaves of bread, pies, beer, cider, or wine. Then she cleared the table again. She washed the dishes. Sometimes she ground grain. She mended clothes. She weeded the herb garden. She fed chickens and pigs, collected eggs, milked cows and goats, churned butter, made candles. She polished armor, scrubbed floors, dusted furniture, swept chimneys, trimmed bushes, hauled buckets of water, and chopped wood. And if there was a party or celebration, she stayed up late, making sure everything was perfect. Sometimes she'll watch the nobleman dance with a torch. In her hand, she sang songs, she told jokes, she poured drinks, she juggled, she dressed up as hairy wild men, she decorated art, she waved a white cloth, signaling when it was time for the bride to enter the chapel. Basically, she did everything. Even if the weather was bad, she never stopped. Still, they had to get up before sunrise and get buckets of icy water from the well or stream. Then, they stoked the fires in the kitchens and grand halls, scrubbed laundry with their frozen fingers, chopped wood and cooked over smoky fires. The smoke stung your eyes, and the damp crept into your bones. Sometimes, sometimes, the kitchen fire burned so fiercely that it warmed the rest of the room. A young girl could do this job. She might have been a servant who worked for wages, or a peasant whose family was renting a small plot of land from the lord. Either way, her job was essential. Without food, castle folk would starve. Also, during the winter, people ate a lot of meat and fat. Hunting season was open, and lords liked to feast. With all those animals to prepare, the serving girl hardly noticed the cold. Well, maybe she did, but if she complained, she risked punishment. Religion was important to medieval women, whether they were peasant or princess. Women were also in charge of sick children, and this could be worrying, since many diseases struck kids down. Fever, cough, measles, chickenpox, scarlet fever, and the plague. These were some of the worst, and if the castle didn't have a physician living within its walls, then the mother or one of her ladies-in-waiting would care for the child. This might include applying poultices, keeping the child clean and comfortable, feeding them and praying. A lot. Some women brewed herbs and concocted their own medicines. They sang songs to keep spirits high and read Bible stories. They also sent for a physician if the child's condition worsened. This could be a man or a woman, since female physicians were allowed to practice during the Middle Ages. Whenever a child died, the mother grieved. She might have ordered a shroud and coffin and seen to it that the child was buried properly. Women also managed the servants. This was easier in summer, when people could work outside in the gardens or walk the grounds. But in winter, when everything had to happen inside, it could be trying. Servants crowded into rooms where fires struggled to keep warm. A wrong word or look could result in punishment, and that was up to the noblewoman. While men were expected to fight and conquer, women were supposed to be modest, quiet, and obedient. A jealous lord might accuse his wife of wrongdoing if he got angry about something else. He might blame her for his own failures, or he might be suspicious if someone had whispered something in his ear. Then the burden of running the castle fell to her shoulders. She kept an eye on stores and supplies. Did they have enough grain, enough salted meat? Were there plenty of thick woolen blankets stored in the solar or great hall? She organized feasts for any nobles who stopped by, and if there were celebrations for Christmas, New Year's, or other holy days, then she had to see that all went well. Noble women oversaw servants, making sure people were doing their jobs, from the cook to the stable boys. They managed the accounts for wages and bills. They checked on building projects, and if something needed repair, they arranged it. They also had children, and this could be very difficult. There was no such thing as prenatal care. Women just got on with it. In fact, a noblewoman would have borne children in all seasons: summer, fall, winter, spring, in good weather or bad. Sometimes a noblewoman went into labor in the night, and only her female servants helped her, along with a midwife. A cloth soaked in hot wine was the closest thing to pain relief, and the midwife knew how to apply pressure to the right spots, helping the child to be born. After the birth, she checked the child for any obvious defects. Then the midwife prepared a potion for the mother to drink, helping her to expel the placenta. Sometimes a noblewoman lost a child during childbirth, and this happened quietly, almost always in the night. No one said much about it, though the midwife recorded the death in the ledger, along with the cause if known. If a stillborn child lived only a few hours, or was never viable, then no one was told. Only God and the servants knew. If the noblewoman survived, she got back into bed, and the next day, everyone acted as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't always so simple. Occasionally, a noblewoman miscarried several times, and in those cases, her ladies-in-waiting tried to cheer her up. They might have gone out walking, playing games, or simply chattered gossip while working on needles. If the noblewoman was expecting another child soon, her ladies-in-waiting likely prayed that the baby would stay put and grow healthy. During the Middle Ages, noblewomen started their lives as children. When they were old enough, they began learning how to behave in court. Their parents found suitable matches and set the wedding date. Usually, a girl married young, typically around 14 years old. Once married, she moved into her husband's castle or manor house and lived there most of the year. She visited her parents' home maybe twice a year, or maybe only once. Winter was often the time for these visits, because travel was impossible during the other seasons. So the young noblewoman returned home for a short while, saw her family and friends, caught up on gossip, and then went back to her own place. She bore children, managed the household, and welcomed guests. Her life was full of work. Most of the time she enjoyed it, but occasionally it could be downright hard, especially in the winter. First, we'll look at life for noble women in the castle. Then later, we'll discuss things for peasant and serving girls. For noble women, life in the castle was complicated. If she was a Christian, she prayed every morning and evening. Next, we'll discuss life for peasant women or serving girls in a medieval castle. Another important part of her job was baking bread. Finally, there was childbirth. This happened wherever there was room, on a wooden bench, in a hay-stuffed pallet, sometimes right in the middle of the kitchen. In stories, the medieval lady waits by the fire, beautiful and wistful.